respective classes. So again, you're speaking to a group of grade 10s. We've opened up the unit of study, or rather the course, with an appreciation around understanding popular culture, the fact that within popular culture there's an opportunity to be critical and to decipher the political. We're taking in a screening of It tomorrow, and we just really want to encourage these students when they're watching a film like It to be as critically astute as possible. And in speaking with you today, hopefully in your expertise working within the horror genre, you can provide perhaps the students with a framework to watch It and have an appreciation when it comes to the origins of horror. So I won't take up much of your time, hopefully just 20 minutes, but why should students and adults, why should, when we go to the movies, say a film like It, why should we be aware of the politics of genre, or the origins of a particular genre?
Well, genre. Every genre is a living tradition. So all of popular culture is organized generically, whether it's popular music or television or comic books or films or whatever. And this tradition, I say, is a living tradition because every genre will have distinctive elements in it. So if we're talking about film genres right now, let's talk about the elements that are in a particular film genre. So whether it's science fiction or horror or Western or romantic comedy, the films that we put into that genre will have certain elements, certain conventions in common. Those conventions express cultural meanings in a kind of shorthand way.
Because
Yep.
Can you just, because obviously in the course we've been speaking much about popular media through that cultural and social discourse, can you build upon that cultural meaning beyond just conventions and style? What's specific about cultural meaning? Why is that understanding that urgent for students?
Well, I mean, how do we understand? Well, living involves negotiating the world in which we live, the values that our society has, how we relate to that society, the values that society cherishes. So our culture, our society produces these genre works to engage in dialogue with us. They address specific cultural issues and anxieties. And if we can understand how those genres are addressing us through the conventions, we can understand how culture is trying to negotiate its own issues.
So why do you think, and I know you just took in TIFF, and there's a variety of different genres that are on display there, but in terms of the popular theatrical experience, there does seem to be a resurgence of sorts in the popularity, the box office popularity of horror films, especially earlier this year with Get Out. And it seems that it's becoming a bit more highbrow. It has been critically well received. Why would you argue culturally, why has there been this resurgence potentially in the mass popularity of horror cinema?
Well, I think just to start to answer that question with a general observation, I think that whenever genres rise and fall. So, once upon a time, the Western, like 80% of Hollywood films that were made could be fit into the Western category. It was the dominant genre. Now people say the Western is dead. We get a Western here, a Western there. So there are things we could look to in the culture to talk about why the Western has declined in popularity. By the same token, I think horror and other forms of kind of speculative fiction, like science fiction or fantasy, have become more popular in part because of particular tensions that are coming to the surface in our culture now. So, for example, in the 1950s, we had a lot of horror and science fiction monster movies because of the tensions around the concerns people felt about the Cold War and potential, nuclear attack, and after the end of World War II, and people saw what could happen with a nuclear attack in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So we've got all those kinds of films in the 50s, and those monsters are typically explained as being mutations from nuclear testing or long dormant creatures that are awakened by nuclear testing. So I think we could say a similar kind of thing is going on now. This particular cultural moment in history is fraught with anxieties and tensions, which the most obvious example is Donald Trump as president. He has done all kinds of things to divide the country, to set one group against another, and so we see this in Get Out, for example, which plays on racial anxieties that were somewhat below the radar for a little while, but Trump helped to bring them out to the surface. So I think a lot of horror films now relate to things that are specifically going on in the culture. And can I give you another example?
Yeah, please. Yeah, no, the students are listening. I am as well, so please do.
Okay. Hopefully, some of your students have seen Dark Skies, for example, or Drag Me to Hell.
Yeah, well, Drag Me to Hell is just... I made mention to them about Drag Me to Hell, but that's a little bit before their time, but maybe a must-watch leading up to Halloween. But what a fantastic film. Can you address that one?
Sorry, I couldn't make out what you said.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying that I have addressed Drag Me to Hell to my students. I believe that came out in summer of 2009, so that's a bit before their time. I have encouraged them to watch it. Hopefully they'll take it as a Halloween film. Could you address that film? Because that's a completely underrated horror film. It should have been much more popular at that, upon its release, but I think it would have done terribly well right now, more so than it did in 2009.
Well, I think so. And the reason why I mentioned that film and Dark Skies is because I think both of those films direct their horror toward economic anxieties, and it's no coincidence that Drag Me to Hell came out. I mean, you said it was 2009. You said?
Yes, just after the Great Recession.
Exactly. So, if you remember, during that recession, the TV announcers, they kept using the phrase "the fiscal cliff," and we were on the edge of the fiscal cliff. And in Get Out to Hell, Drag Me to Hell, the main character, played by Alison Lowen, she wants to rise in the corporate ladder. She works at a bank, and in order to impress her boss, she doesn't renew the mortgage for a poor gypsy woman, right, who puts the curse on her.
Yes.
And at the very end, she literally gets dragged over the fiscal cliff. She gets pulled off a railway platform, down to the netherworld, because she couldn't make it in the cutthroat world of business. She felt guilty after she didn't renew the mortgage for that woman.
Yes.
So that what that film is addressing is the conflict between moral feelings that we might have and the ruthlessness which we have to engage in economic competition in order to better ourselves. So,
and that's a fantastic film. And again, I'm going to really encourage the students to take it in. Why has then I'm not sure if you've watched it, and I'm not asking you to get into that respective film, but it is one of Stephen King's more popular novels. We had that mini series in the summer of 1990 with Tim Curry as Pennywise.
Right.
Why do you think, I shouldn't say why as because it's not a concrete answer, but why do you think just it's received such a kind of box office response, and why has Stephen King as of late even had a little bit of a resurgence from the Dark
Yeah.
Tower to this, because now Stephen King seems to be part of the popular conversation, where things seem to be quiet a little bit not too long ago.
Well, Stephen King seems to be having a resurgence even despite the Dark Tower, which
Yes.
I did not see that film, but from the trailers, it looked like it was not a very good adaptation.
No, it was terrible. It was terrible.
But Stephen King, as you probably know, is he's not only a prolific writer who's had many of his works adapted to film already, but is also quite knowledgeable about the history of horror and theories of horror. And this is clear in his book, Dance Macabre, which is not a fiction book, but is a book about horror.
Mm-hmm.
So he's very knowledgeable. Now, I think one of the things that might explain why he's having a resurgence now is that the demographics have been shifting over the years for audiences for films. It's becoming younger.
Mm-hmm.
And, films are deliberately targeting that younger audience. And you can see this strategy in the rise of, young adult or YA fiction, and with the success of the Twilight books and films, and the Harry Potter books and films,
and the Hunger Games and
all the Hunger Games.
Yes, all those titles.
Yeah. So all of those, I think, has brought more younger people out to the movies because they can relate to the characters and identify with them. Mm-hmm. And I think, somebody sitting around the table in the producer's office must have said, well, young people are kind of relating to these films now. So let's go back to Stephen King because he's been surefire in the past. Mm-hmm. And all of the protagonists, the main characters of that narrative, are teenagers. Mm-hmm. So I think if a 50-year-old went to that film, they'd have a hard time relating to the characters, but not so for young people. Mm-hmm. And with it specifically, which is kind of like a horror version of Stand By Me.
Yes.
Some of the characters look like they came from central casting. Okay, you be the nerd, you be the bully. So you'll see that when you go to the film. But a lot of people will remember that, especially young people, when they were children, they were afraid of clowns a little bit. Mm-hmm. But the clown also, he takes different forms in the film, and he basically comes to embody all of the fears that young people have. Or have had over the course of their childhood.
And when we talk about Stephen King primarily, and he's in his literature, youth have definitely played a part within his narratives. And maybe this is important for the students in the room who have not read King or maybe seen some of his earlier films, but what are some of his genre thematic motifs, if you will, that perhaps we can take in when we're watching it tomorrow?
Well, I think probably the biggest dynamic, the most pronounced dynamic going on in his narrative is the conflicts between adulthood and childhood, mm-hmm. And the difficulties of negotiating childhood and attaining adulthood. So. That would fit perfectly with the structure of it, which is going to have a sequel in which the characters come back as adults.
Yes. Now, one more. I'm writing down a series of notes here, but and nodding dramatically as you're making these great references. What? Maybe one final question, because I don't want to take up your morning. So we're going to be in the theater. We have grade 10s, 11s, and 12 students. I'm going to be providing them with a reading. Other students are going to hear this conversation. What could be one of the provocative questions I ask these students, not that I want you to do my job for me, that they can keep in mind ahead of time and reflect upon while they're watching the film. Not just in terms of it, but in terms of the horror genre itself.
Yeah, I think just approaching the genre as a whole. If you remember back to the beginning of our conversation, where I said that all works of a particular genre have certain elements in common.
Mm-hmm.
So if we think about horror, there's a basic structure that informs almost all horror narratives, and that is, most works of horror, not all, but most of them have some form of monster in it.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have to look at, and the conflict is between the monster and those characters that represent normality or, the status quo of
mm-hmm.
society.
Mm-hmm.
So what kind of threat, and what's the relationship between the two? That's how it's played out in the story. And that's where you can look for the theme.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the relationship between Pennywise and the characters who experience him?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and so if the students can focus in on that, and of course, all monster movies, it's not just a monster rampaging; it's always put into a narrative context.
Mm-hmm.
So the narrative is containing that monster. So what's the context for this monster? What kind of lives are these young people living?
Okay, that's it, and that's would be the context in which our students need to really look at it. So, not merely what's the relationship between Pennywise and the characters, but importantly, who are these characters? What are their backstories, and what are their fears, and where do those fears originate from?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you. You just did my job for me, so I do. I appreciate that, but it's a great guiding question. So when they're watching the film, it's not a surprise for them. So they're going to be receiving this question beforehand, and also I'll be sharing this conversation with the other 100 or so students who will be attending what's become a very popular film now that it's grossing almost $300 million.
I think it may have set a few records for opening week of a horror film release.
Yes, yeah, and I think without inflation and ticket sales, it's being Exorcist. So it is very much part of this popular conversation. The It book sales have gone through the roof. So it's always nice to bring students to the theater when something's happening in the moment and take it in as a shared experience, and then have a great conversation about it. So thank you so much again, Barry, for taking the time to speak with us. I'll let you enjoy your morning. And I'll definitely touch base. So next time I'm visiting my folks, we can get together for a coffee.
Okay. Yep. Give me a call, and I hope the screening goes well, and let me know how the students.
I will. Thank you. I say thank you so much to Professor Grant.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Okay. Take care.
You're welcome.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.